2 days after Mr. Bennet returned home, he received a letter from Mr. Gardner. After reading it, he went out walking. When Elizabeth and Jane found him, he handed the letter to Elizabeth. She read, "At last I have news of my niece. I have seen them both. They are not yet married. But if you consent to the following agreement, I hope they will be soon. All that is required is Lydia's share of her inheritance and £100 a year. Send back an answer as soon as you can." Mr. Bennet shook his head sadly. No man in his senses would marry Lydia for so little. He said, "I need to know how much money your uncle has given Wickham. How am I ever going to repay him?" Unlike her husband, Mrs. Bennet was joyful. It had been a fortnight since she'd come downstairs. But that night, she took her seat at the head of the table. "My dear, dear Lydia," she cried. "Married at 16. How I long to see her, and dear Wickham, too. Now she must have clothes and servants. And she must not live more than 10 miles away. I couldn't bear it." Mr. Bennet let her talk while the servants were present. But when they left, he said, "Mrs. Bennet, wherever they live, there is one house they will never enter, this one." A long argument followed, but Mr. Bennet was firm. He refused to give Lydia a single pound for clothes. As Elizabeth listened, she thought of Mr. Darcy. Now she was sorry she'd told him about Lydia and Wickham. Yet the situation was hopeless. How could Darcy ever join a family that included Wickham? She finally understood that she and Darcy would have suited each other perfectly. Her liveliness would have softened his stiff manner. His judgment and knowledge of the world would have improved her mind. Mr. Gardner wrote once more to say the marriage would take place in a few days. Wickham would be joining the army and then be moving north. Before he left, he and Lydia hoped to visit the family. Jane and Elizabeth felt that Lydia should be allowed to visit. They urged Mr. Bennet so earnestly that he finally agreed. Wickham and Lydia came. Lydia was the same as ever, noisy, wild, and fearless. She demanded congratulations from everyone. Wickham, too, showed no sign of shame for what he'd done. Elizabeth was disgusted. She quickly saw that Lydia cared more for Wickham than he did for her. Why had he run away with her at all? But then she remembered that he'd left Brighton because of his debts. Her uncle must have given him money. Soon after her arrival, Lydia insisted on telling Elizabeth and Jane about the wedding. "We were to be at the church at 11 o'clock, she said. "Then my uncle was called away on business. I was afraid he'd be late. But then I remembered that Mr. Darcy could have taken his place." "Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth cried out. "Oh." Lydia cried out. "That was supposed to be a secret." "Don't say another word," Jane said. Elizabeth was burning with curiosity. As soon as she was alone, she wrote to her aunt. She asked why Mr. Darcy had been at Lydia's wedding. Her aunt very quickly sent a reply. Mr. Darcy had gone to visit Mrs. Young, Georgiana's former governess. At first, Mrs. Young refused to say a word. But eventually Darcy was able to find out where the couple was staying. After meeting with Wickham several times, Darcy worked out an agreement with him, by paying for everything. The letter confused Elizabeth. Her heart said that Darcy had done it all for her. But her head couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet had news that Bingley was returning to Netherfield Hall. "As soon as Bingley comes," she said to her husband, "you must visit him." Mr. Bennet refused. But this time, it was Mr. Bingley who came to visit. Mr. Darcy was with him. Mrs. Bennet was overly gracious to Mr. Bingley, and rude to Mr. Darcy. Jane managed to be calm, but Elizabeth was very uneasy. She waited to see how Darcy would behave. Darcy was nearly silent for the entire visit. Why did he come? Elizabeth wondered. Jane was happier than she dared to admit. A few days later, Bingley came again, alone. With high hopes, Mrs. Bennet called Mary, Elizabeth, and Kitty upstairs. As soon as Jane and Bingley were alone, he proposed. When he left, Jane came to Elizabeth, glowing with joy. "It is too much," she said. "Far too much. Oh, Elizabeth. I don't deserve such happiness." Elizabeth thought to herself, so this is the end of all Darcy's worrying and Caroline's lies. What a happy ending, indeed.